The Senate has had multiple votes going on throughout the day, but the main one, I want to put this up on your screen, is what we now know, that the Senate did vote on the Shutdown Fairness Act. That vote ultimately failing at the beginning of this hour. And so if you're not familiar with what we're talking about here, today the Senate was voting on whether or not to advance the Shutdown Fairness Act. This was a bill that was put forth by GOP Senator Ron Johnson. The current version of the legislation would pay federal employees who have continued to work throughout this shutdown, but Johnson has an amendment that would also pay furloughed workers. The motion to proceed needed 60 votes to ultimately succeed. Johnson noted that major unions representing federal employees also supported this legislation. But about 10 to 15 or so minutes ago, we watched as that ultimately failed.
The moment the Senate roll call ended, something rare happened in Washington. Not outrage, not applause, silence. The kind of silence that settles when people realize power has shifted and there's no way to spin it back. Because for the first time in this presidency, Donald Trump did not just lose a vote, he lost control. This wasn't a messaging setback. It wasn't a procedural hiccup. It was a public rebuke on the record, on one of the most sacred authorities the presidency claims, the power to wage war. And it happened despite threats, pressure, intimidation, and loyalty tests. It happened because even members of Trump's own party finally decided there had to be a line. What the Senate did was simple in form and explosive in consequence. They voted to advance a war powers resolution that would block the president from conducting further military operations in or against Venezuela without explicit congressional authorization. Strip away the legal language, and the meaning is unmistakable. Congress told the President of the United States, "We do not trust you to start wars on your own." That sentence alone would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Presidents guard war powers fiercely. Parties close ranks around them. Even symbolic challenges are rare. But this wasn't symbolic. 5 Republican senators crossed their own president on national security, and Trump couldn't stop them. That's the part you need to sit with. Donald Trump did everything he knows how to do when his authority is challenged. He personally called senators. He dispatched staff. He leaned on donors. He threatened political consequences. He went to social media and publicly attacked anyone who wavered. He framed dissent as betrayal. He claimed restricting his power would help America's enemies, the full playbook. And it didn't work. When the vote came, the resolution advanced. 52 senators voted yes. 47 voted no. The numbers matter, but the symbolism matters more. This wasn't Democrats versus Republicans. This was constitutional authority versus personal loyalty. And loyalty lost. Visual cue, Senate chamber, roll call board. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what triggered it. Days before the vote, the Trump administration authorized a dramatic military operation inside Venezuela. U.S. Special Forces conducted a raid that resulted in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, a sitting head of state seized by American forces and transported to the United States. There are no precedents for that in modern American foreign policy, not clean ones anyway. Capturing another country's leader without a declaration of war is not a strike. It's not a limited action. It is an act that rewrites the relationship between two nations overnight. Inside Congress, alarm bells went off immediately. Senators from both parties started asking questions that should have been answered before any operation like that took place. What is the objective? Are we at war with Venezuela? How long does this last? Are U.S. forces staying? Who governs next? What happens if Venezuela retaliates? What happens if their allies retaliate? Those questions were met with vague answers. Talk of restoring democracy, references to oil reserves, broad language about regional stability. What was missing was a plan. A clear end state, a defined scope, the very things Congress is constitutionally responsible for debating before the nation goes to war. That vacuum terrified senators, because history teaches a brutal lesson. Wars don't start with clear exit strategies. They start with dramatic moments, bold moves, and leaders insisting it will be quick. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. Each began with confidence. Each devolved into years of chaos and consequences no one claimed ownership of. So senators acted, not because they suddenly became pacifists, not because they opposed American power, but because they recognized something dangerous unfolding in real time. A president acting first and daring Congress to clean up afterward. This is where the constitutional stakes come into focus. The founders were explicit about one thing: the power to declare war belongs to Congress, not because they distrusted presidents personally, but because they distrusted concentration of power. They had lived under a king who could drag nations into conflict on whim. They built a system designed to slow that impulse down. Over decades, that balance eroded. Presidents of both parties expanded their authority. Congress often complained, but rarely enforced its role. Authorizations passed in one context were stretched to justify operations in entirely different regions decades later. Emergency powers became habits. Habits became norms. Until Venezuela, because capturing another country's president without congressional authorization crossed a psychological threshold. It forced senators to confront a simple question: if this doesn't trigger oversight, what does? If this is allowed, where is the limit? 5 Republican senators answered that question by voting to reassert Congress's authority. Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Rand Paul, Josh Hawley, Todd Young. They do not share ideology. They do not share political strategy. Some are moderates, some are populists, some are libertarians, some are foreign policy hawks. But they shared a conclusion: this president could not be allowed to escalate military conflict without congressional consent. That convergence matters. It tells you this wasn't about party branding. It was about fear of where unchecked power leads. Trump's response was immediate and predictable. He lashed out. He accused them of undermining the presidency. He claimed they were empowering America's enemies. He suggested they should never hold office again. It was classic Trump: loud, aggressive, absolute, and ineffective. Because once a vote is cast, it cannot be erased. Once a senator breaks ranks publicly, the spell is broken. Fear loses its grip. The question shifts from, "What will Trump do to me?" to "What happens if I do nothing?" Now here's the part that demands precision. The resolution did not ultimately become binding law. Procedural maneuvers and a tie-breaking vote by Vice President J.D. Vance blocked final passage. That detail matters legally. But it does not erase the political damage, because the Senate still advanced it. The Senate still recorded the votes. The Senate still sent a message that echoed far beyond the chamber. This president does not have unlimited authority, and his own party is willing to say so. In Washington, recorded votes are artifacts. They don't disappear when bills die. They resurface in hearings, in campaigns, in court filings, in history books. This vote will be cited every time Trump claims absolute control over national security. This is why Trump's brand took such a hit. His power has never come from persuasion or coalition building. It has come from projection, the image of dominance, the belief that crossing him carries catastrophic consequences. But here were 5 senators who crossed him and survived. They defended their votes. Their constituencies did not revolt. Donors did not flee en masse. The earth did not open. That realization spreads quietly but quickly, and it changes behavior. Zoom out, and the pattern becomes clearer. This vote did not happen in isolation. Republicans have shown increasing willingness to defy Trump in specific contexts: on access to Epstein-related documents, on healthcare subsidies, on annexation rhetoric involving Greenland, on budget brinkmanship. Each defection lowers the cost of the next one. Each successful act of resistance normalizes dissent. That is how strongman politics erodes, not in one dramatic collapse, but in a series of small refusals that accumulate into loss of control. There's also an international dimension that cannot be ignored. Allies and adversaries watch congressional votes closely. When a president's own party moves to restrict his war powers, it signals uncertainty. It tells foreign governments that U.S. responses may be constrained, that escalation carries internal risk. That cuts both ways. It can deter reckless action by the president. It can also embolden adversaries who perceive hesitation. Either way, it fundamentally alters the strategic landscape Trump operates within. This is where Trump's argument collapses under scrutiny. He claims oversight weakens America, that requiring congressional approval ties his hands. That division signals vulnerability. But the Constitution was designed precisely to force deliberation in moments like this. Oversight is not sabotage. It is governance. The resolution did not bar all military action. It did not prevent immediate self-defense. It required authorization for sustained or expanded operations. That is not micromanagement. That is accountability. And Trump cannot articulate a coherent counter-argument because his position rests on assertion, not law. "I'm the president" is not a constitutional doctrine. It is a personal claim. When senators rejected that claim, his response was rage. And rage, in politics, is often a tell. It signals loss of leverage. Now consider what this means going forward. First, it constrains Trump's options. Any attempt to escalate in Venezuela now carries political risk. Another war powers vote could be introduced. This time, momentum would favor passage. Senators would not want to appear complicit if escalation leads to disaster. Second, it opens the door to further congressional challenges. War powers are just one arena. Once Congress asserts itself successfully, it can do so again on sanctions, on emergency declarations, on executive orders that test legal boundaries. Third, it reshapes internal Republican dynamics. Senators are watching each other closely. They are recalculating. If 5 could do this and survive, why not 6? Why not 10? Trump's margins are thin. He governs by near unanimity. Cracks matter. Fourth, it feeds into the 2026 midterm narrative. Democrats will not frame this as partisan opposition. They will frame it as a bipartisan intervention. Ads will feature Republicans saying Trump went too far. That messaging resonates with voters exhausted by chaos. This is where Trump's greatest vulnerability lies. He thrives on polarization. He falters when criticism comes from inside the House. When his own party limits him, the argument that he is merely a victim of opposition collapses. There is also a psychological dimension worth acknowledging. Trump equates control with legitimacy. When control slips, he compensates by escalating rhetoric and action. That pattern is well documented. Pressure produces impulsivity. Impulsivity produces mistakes. The danger is not that Trump becomes cautious. The danger is that he tries to reassert dominance through dramatic moves that further alienate allies and empower critics. That spiral has consequences: political, legal, international. At a deeper level, this episode forces a reckoning with how fragile norms really are. For years, the expansion of executive war powers went largely unchecked because presidents exercised them incrementally. Trump did not. He tested the outer limits in one move. That shock forced Congress to remember its role. And once an institution remembers its power, it rarely forgets. This is why the vote matters even without binding law. It reactivated a dormant muscle. It reminded senators that they are not ornamental, that they have leverage, that the Constitution is not self-enforcing. Trump's defenders argue this was an overreaction. That bold action was necessary, that Congress is slow and divided, that enemies exploit hesitation. Those arguments are not frivolous, but they require evidence, strategy, planning. What Trump offered instead was impulse followed by indignation. That is not leadership. That is improvisation with global consequences. So where does this leave us? It leaves us at a turning point that won't feel dramatic in the moment. No fireworks, no resignation, no single headline declaring collapse. Just a shift, subtle, structural, irreversible. Trump is weaker today than he was before that vote. Not because the resolution passed into law, but because authority depends on compliance, and compliance depends on belief. Belief cracked. Once that happens, power drains quietly. History shows this pattern repeatedly. Leaders who rely on fear eventually discover its limits. Once people realize the cost of defiance is survivable, fear loses utility. Governance becomes harder. Loyalty becomes conditional. Control becomes performative. That is the terrain Trump now occupies. This vote did not end his presidency. It did something more consequential. It ended the assumption that he is untouchable, and assumptions once broken do not return. 10 years from now, analysts will point to moments like this when explaining how unchecked power finally met resistance. Not through spectacle, through process, through votes, through people deciding the Constitution mattered more than allegiance. This is not the last chapter. It is the moment the story changed direction. If you want to understand where this is heading before it arrives, subscribe. The patterns are visible if you know where to look.